During my audience to discussions on the justification of constructs such as the state and the monopolization of capital to expropriate the surplus value of labor for profit, I frequently observed the use of the argument appealing to human nature, almost exclusively by statists and capitalists. Their argument boils down to the assertion that without the state, people would choose to cause one another harm and death. And without the monopolization of capital, nobody would choose to work for the enrichment of humanity. It is painfully self-evident that the monopolization of capital is overwhelmingly vested in the interest of enriching the owners of capital. The enrichment of the rest of humanity is an afterthought. It has also been observed that the commodification of labor under the free market has led to the outsourcing of jobs to overworked, underpaid loom workers and seamsters overseas to preserve the already perversely abundant capital monopolized by the super-wealthy, who go on to obsessively perpetuate their habitual cuts to spending on the workers and the workplace until it causes humanitarian disasters in one form or another, as seen in the case of the collapse of the Savar building in Bangladesh in 2012, which claimed the lives of many workers who had previously expressed concerns to their bosses about the building's integrity for weeks prior to the incident, or the lives lost during the American labor movement, as many organizers who demanded fewer hours, higher wages, and better working conditions were arrested or incarcerated, or worse, executed or assassinated. I would like to discuss the rather pessimistic flaws inherent to the arguments brought in by the right about what they claim to be human nature. This calls into mind their notions about socialists simply being entitled and repeating ad nauseum that we simply want more taxes, more welfare, fewer hours, and higher wages, and to just sit on these benefits while contributing as little to society as possible, and that they know this about us because they claim this to be true of everyone else, even themselves. This argument is also terribly reminiscent of the tragedy of the commons, which has actually been disproven many times over throughout the course of decades through basic historical analysis of the communally owned and organized land, resources, and labor, which proved that the tragedy almost never happened. But that's not the biggest problem with these arguments. As some of the more astute leftists on YouTube have pointed out, this is taking the arguments for rational self-interest, projecting their logic onto the left, and presupposing it to be true for socialists and humanity as a whole. This to me is showcasing the ignorance necessary to merely guess, and comedically incorrectly at that, the aims of socialism and the arrogance requisite to claim that there is only one mode in which human nature can manifest itself, and the claim to the unique expertise as to what that mode happens to be. Now let's set the discussion about human nature aside for a moment and consider that the actual aim of the left is not to increase spending on wages and welfare, but to build the infrastructure and culture necessary to render wages and welfare irrelevant. This is indeed the case, as has been explicated by many leftists innumerable times, from the 19th century to the 21st. And due to the power structures at play being geared toward their own supremacy and self-preservation at the expense of their subjects, they will never hold any referenda if they must declare themselves fundamentally incorrect about the human condition and therefore irrelevant or even harmful to the peace and prosperity of human society, be they the state or the market. Let it be made abundantly clear that I see no distinction between the state and the market. As the state is a body that claims a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence, the capitalists of the market claim a monopoly over the legitimate use of deprivation. As the state selectively uses the leverage of violence to enforce obedience upon its dissenters, the capitalists vocally train their guns of austerity and intimidation onto the left to enforce complicity with their cause of perverse wealth accumulation. As the state claims the pretense of sovereignty within national borders, capitalists claim the pretense of ownership within the premises of the workplace, a pretense that is forcibly corroborated by the state. As taxation is theft by infrastructure upon profit, the extraction of wages and the cost of living is the taxation by capital upon labor. As the saying goes, rent is theft. Where do you think money even comes from in the first place? It is tendered to the market by the state, and it's not as if capitalists don't have any hand in manipulating market prices to suit their own agenda of accumulating capital by means of manipulative and misleading advertising to manufacture demand for their products, or worse yet, destroying or hiding products and commodities to manufacture rarity. Another means that is convenient for capitalists to abandon any fair sense of mutual benefit in trade is by charging exorbitant prices on products and services that are governed by perfect inelastic demand, artificially raising profits on such products and services that are essential to life as food, medicine, and shelter, literally off the backs of the workers as they try to increase their collective productivity in order to raise their own standards of living. It is of absolutely no consequence how steadfastly the proletarians bootstrap themselves in attempts to escape poverty. The capitalist vampires will always be there to exploit their gains through essentials. Any bootlicking apologist who defends these privileged parasites is morally bankrupt and is thus to be regarded with utmost contempt, especially if their only response is to tell others to learn basic economics. Well, I did. And that's how I learned about perfect inelastic demand and that it can be and often is exploited in the first place. The primary cause for capitalists and statists to use arguments appealing to their preconceived notions of human nature is that it is the only concept that grants their supremacy any legitimacy, to make their harsh attitudes toward their fellow man very clear, that their systems of power and profit are the only way to help people achieve peace and prosperity, that there are no other options and we must play by their rules, that the only reason anyone cooperates with each other is because people must be given external incentives by these authoritarians to provide a better existence for themselves and their fellow man, that any resistance to their supremacy would inevitably lead to misery. We see that peace and prosperity are the carrot, and violence and austerity are the stick, without any consideration that the state and the capitalists are the ones wielding the stick, that any misery that comes from resistance is on the part of a reaction to our resistance. Integrity and courage are necessary to see the end of such misery, and not capitulation. Historical analysis by Elinor Ostrom of the Commons has essentially proven that the state and capitalism are not necessary for peace or self-sufficiency, despite the claims by their supporters about human nature. It's all they have to defend themselves. If they cannot reliably project their own logic to the rational processes of their anarchist critics, they are rightly going to experience losses in their credibility and their popular support, as they are experiencing these losses today and will continue to do so tomorrow. And complicity with their cause would have to be enforced either by violence or fraud, and the end result is the expropriation of the proletariat for class collaboration with the sole interests of capitalists in mind, a method that is patently used only by fascists. As for the notion that humans are inherently greedy, the claim becomes entirely inconsistent with reality every time a citizen happily donates to charity, and arguments about humans being inherently lazy and will refuse to work without the assurance of reward are dismantled by all instances of somebody doing volunteer work. The incentives present within charity and volunteering correspond to solidarity and mutual aid, parts of the human psyche that disprove the right-wing narrative of human nature. As a matter of fact, solidarity and mutual aid are inseparable from human nature, which leads many people on the cusp of defecting to the left, and to question what human nature is, whether or not it is fixed, what its constituent tendencies are, and how it relates to culture, environment, and the behavior of individuals and collectives. I may know nothing about why humans have been recorded to give up their money, time, and labor solely for the benefit of those in want, but at least I don't claim any perceived achievement in economic studies to be synonymous with authority as to the natural inclinations of human beings. But then again, I'm no economist. But the courses I have taken in economics have actually led me further to the left, seeing that the entire system of neoliberal economics is absolutely dysfunctional through its very constituent machinations, from being addled with resentment toward the workforce, as though they exist in a vacuum and are entitled to their socio-economic standing, and the workforce are trying to cheat them out of their thrones, as they have likely cheated the workforce to claim their thrones themselves. These miscreants have lost sight of their goodness and project their lack of compassion and grace onto others who genuinely care for their fellow man and will at least try to take committed action in helping others. I will not bother dignifying the state with its misanthropic analysis of its subjects with any lengthy discussion. The state projects its own barbarous violence of mass murder and torture onto others, and unrelentingly pushes the narrative that it is imperative to keep the state in its own hypocrisy against the good faith of our fellow human beings, who most often are peaceful without coercion by the state. As long as the state is perceived to be peaceful and our fellow man violent, the peace inherent to humanity itself can never be realized. Only the dominance and supremacy of the state, as it mendaciously equates its own dominance to peace. Thus the violence of the state is vindicated and honored, while the resistance to its authority is brutally punished and antagonized. The state and the bourgeoisie, as Christians, also claim their misanthropic tendencies to be in the service of God, conveniently forgetting that St. Luke wrote the passage saying that the kingdom of God is in men, and that God in his wisdom and grace loves all his creations. Not that I am a Christian, but if God is an entity that we are to emulate, then we ought to see God's love for his children in our hearts as the love for all our brothers and sisters, and to take faith in the compassion and love of our fellow man for us, as we take faith that God feels the very same for us, and reciprocate all the same to our fellow man, as any Christian feels we should toward God. I think this should follow based on the very principle of faith, that there should be no room for distrust or hatred toward humanity, nor particular trust or admiration toward politicians or the rich.